Hello, and welcome to the Austin Parks Summit Series. I'm Kathleen Barron, Senior Programs Manager for Austin Parks Foundation. Just so you know, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You can view all of our past sessions at austinparks.org/parks-summit. And you can also see a recording of this session after the fact. So if you miss out on part of it or want to view it again or share it, you can find it on Facebook and also on the Park Summit page. I'm very pleased today to introduce Virginia Spielmann. She's the Executive Director for the Star Institute for Sensory Processing in Colorado. She'll be talking about inclusive playgrounds for, in particular, we'll be focusing on invisible disabilities. So I'm really excited to have her get started. She'll be doing a presentation and we will accept comments and questions, and I'll kind of monitor the comments in Facebook while she's talking, and then at the end we'll leave time to have so that I can ask her the questions that come from Facebook, and hopefully she can get to all those questions in the time that we've allotted. So welcome, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. I am a British trained occupational therapist. I've been in the US for 3 years, and I'm a specialist in child development and infant mental health, play and brain development. As an occupational therapist, we're really interested in how environments can support individuals, among other things. And so I'm really hoping that this presentation will give you some tools for your tool belt as you think about the critical importance of play and playgrounds for your communities, and how important playgrounds are and how much they can bring communities together. And for me, that's what inclusivity is all about. For those of you who are wondering what on earth an occupational therapist is, occupational therapists look at helping people participate in activities that are meaningful to them. And we believe that that supports mental health. And so when you're a child, your primary occupation is play. And as you go through the lifespan, we're not just talking about your vocation, we're not just talking about work. Occupations are the things you want and need to do. We think they're therapeutic, and they help and support well-being and health throughout the lifespan. So they work in many, many domains. Occupational therapists can work in geriatrics, in trauma wards, in hip replacement, in mental health settings, and in pediatrics, which is a lot of the work that Star Institute for Sensory Processing does, but we also have an adolescent and adult program. And so I am going to talk about inclusive playgrounds that support the whole family through the lifespan today. That's what I'm very much interested in. I want you to just know that the language I'm using for this presentation is very deliberate. We have a challenge when we talk about disabilities, that the language is incredibly deficit focused. It's very, very negative. And so we're going to be talking about invisible disabilities today, but I'm really going to be making an effort to recognize that disabilities are often caused by the communities and cultures in which we live that are not inclusive. And we're going to talk more about that later. We have a wonderful resource available to us that has been available to us for many years now, but is growing, which is the self-advocacy movement. And these are adults and adolescents, in fact, as well, and children at times, who have the lived experience of these disabilities and these differences in processing and being in the world. And so if you pay attention to what the advocates are saying, and there are books, many, many books, blogs, Twitter accounts, Facebook pages, wonderful resources that I'd be very happy to point people to if they're interested in. If you listen to what these advocates are saying, they are asking us to consider moving away from identity first language towards person first language. Sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. But for example, I am a woman. I am not a person with femaleness. And we call an athlete, not a person with athleticism. So we're doing identity first language. So many individuals on the autism spectrum are asking us to say, you know, my autistic friend, rather than my friend with autism, because it's not just a terrible situation. It's not it's not such a sad story as we're led to believe by the language we use. So that's deliberate in this presentation. I just want you to know that I'm doing it on purpose. And I will switch between both ways of referring to things, especially if I'm talking about literature, because the literature tends to use this person first language. But I wanted you to know that that's important. I feel it's important to listen to the people we are purporting to help. We're trying to help, and with humility and sensitivity, and respect their self-determination. Another just note while we're talking about language, of something to think about is a principle known as ableism, which permeates society and culture and really everything that we do. And it is this sense that there is one type of body that is the right type of body. And so the world has generally been built for one type of body. And you, I think if you start examining the media that comes across, you know, the way things are portrayed and talked about in the news, TV shows and other things, and once you start noticing this, it's really everywhere, that there is this sense of what a healthy body looks like, an acceptable body, whatever you want to say, and that other types of bodies experience oppression on a daily basis. And it's not just in the way environments are constructed, it's in the way we conduct ourselves as a culture around the world. This occurs. And so some refer to it as disability oppression. It's a marginalized group. It's a poorly represented group. And a lot of it is rooted in a lack of knowledge and understanding of the varied experience of disability. An example of ableism that's somewhat challenging to process perhaps is disability inspiration stories, especially these inspiration stories where the parent is the hero and the disabled child is part of the story, or the friend who sits with the disabled student is the hero and the disabled student is just sort of part of the story. So there's a pity narrative and an inspiration narrative associated with this. And there's a reason I'm setting us up with thinking about this before we start thinking about inclusive community spaces, because they absolutely shouldn't perpetuate ableism. And it requires a lot of effort to make sure that you design spaces that way, because this is so pervasive throughout all of our language, culture, thinking. We've been taught to think this way, the TV shows and things that we watch. So that means it's official, and it's in official practices and it's in unofficial practices. People who are classified as disabled are make up the world's largest minority group, about 1 billion people. That's about 15% of the world population. So 56 million Americans, I think that was in 2017 that number was identified, live with a disability, or what qualifies as a disability. And of course, many people live with disabling conditions, but don't get this official recognition. You know, you may be surprised to know, hopefully you're not, that 12.5% of disabled people have a bachelor's degree or higher. I put it to you that number would be even greater if we had inclusively designed spaces and a culture that was accepting and accessible. 31.5% without a disability have a bachelor's degree in Texas. That's supposed to say with. I looked that up for you guys. And then there's this issue that most disabilities are invisible. And this is really important. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time here. But first, let's just think about the difference between accessible design and universal design. And this is a little bit what I've referred to already, that there is inclusion is really different to accessibility. So there's the ADA requirements for accessibility, and really that's the bare minimum. That's the very least that we can do is meet the legal requirements for a space to be accessible. And so, we know that buildings should be ADA compliant. They should be designed that way, or they should be retrofitted to become ADA compliant. We want our community spaces to be ADA compliant, and so on. But there is more thought that's required to go into design if we want spaces to be universally accessible and completely inclusive. And so what we really mean by universal design is the design of spaces with everyone in mind. And so it's not like there's specialized spots and places for people with disabilities, but it's all ages, all sizes. And I've heard many people refer to that as good design. This is just good design, because it really means everyone can come together. And isn't that what a playground is for? Playgrounds have great meaning once you start paying attention to how those spaces are used. So we really are talking about universal design that really enables inclusion, and it is accessible for all. And then again, I just think about the whole family system. So we're not just talking about children being able to access these spaces, but we want parents, grandparents, and other caregivers to be able to play on the playground with their family without facing barriers to access. So we have these, so universal design supports these domains or these areas. It supports true freedom of choice, which enables autonomy, that ability to access the things I want to access when I want to access in the way I want to access them, rather than being, as I said, sort of allocated to a specific space in the environment. It enables success and independence, and I would also add their interdependence, because one of the really important parts of playground design that I've seen more and more in recent years is recognizing the importance of social interaction on that space, in that space. Diversity and inclusion, of course, and when have we needed that more than now? I'm not sure there's ever been a time when we've needed spaces that support by design diversity and inclusion. I just think that's such a healing place to be as a community, and I'm going to refer to that again as I go through this presentation. So we, and also this idea of self-determination, and self-determination really is about that ability to express ourselves through the choices we make in a way that is self-satisfying and builds our sense of self. And I think playgrounds are this important. I think these are really important spaces where those things can take place. This is just a cartoon, and there are many cartoons I could have chosen that sort of illustrates where I'm coming from. But what you have here is a ramp and stairs next to each other. And the young man in the wheelchair is saying, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the curator, the janitorial support, the head teacher, whoever he is saying, "Well, look, everyone's waiting to use the stairs, and there are more kids that need to use the stairs. So just hang on a second." And of course, looking at this in this context, we can see that, look, everybody could use the ramp. Let's shovel the ramp first, because that's universal access, that's inclusive access. Wouldn't it have been even better if this entrance to the school had been designed with universal access in mind? And so everything was ramped and everyone comes in on a ramp, or one of those ramps that's, blended in with the steps. Those sorts of things make a huge difference to how spaces feel and bring people together. So spaces, I think, can challenge some of these cultural barriers that we face, like ableism. these dominant attitudes in society that devalue and limit the potential of people who move differently and have differently abled bodies. That through the design of our spaces, we can ascribe value or worth to the people who are accessing them. And we shouldn't be ascribing inferior value and asking people to use the side entrance because they have differently abled bodies. And I just think playgrounds are absolutely the place where this can happen best, this inclusive universal design. So just thinking about the disability data again, I just want to mention and really highlight that we're not talking about one or two people here. We're talking about a large proportion of our community that we want to include and deserve to be included, who at the moment experience social injustice and occupational injustice at many, many levels. Like, for example, how many are able to go to university. And I do think that would be different. How easy it is to travel, how easy it is to go to work. When you have a child with a disability in your house, often parents are making choices about their careers that other parents don't have to make because of this lack of inclusion at school and in the community and at church and in the playgrounds, in those community spaces. So really something to think about is how much inclusion would impact the community for the better. And later on, I'm going to try and make that connection between how that benefits us all economically as well. And you can see how I'm starting to build the argument for that here. But we are sort of called to make it possible for every potential skilled worker to be employed in the workplace. And that is something that we all must take responsibility for. I love this spin on it from Michael Nesmith, who did a great TEDx talk. And he just basically says disability drives innovation. It makes us design better spaces. It makes us come up with innovative ways of including one another. And so he says, you know, by being forced to come up with new solutions, you're better for it. And I love embracing that ethos. I think that's a really beneficial philosophy for all of us because, you know, we're going to be unified when we manage to embrace this approach. So I'm really focusing on invisible disabilities today. I will refer a little bit to more ADA, traditional ADA type accessibility pieces every now and then. But I really want to bring to attention this concept of invisible disabilities, hidden disabilities that aren't immediately apparent. And it's estimated that that's 10% of the population, that's a pretty high number there that we're thinking about we need to include. You know, 1 in 2 people in the US is estimated to have a chronic medical condition of one kind or another, 1 in 2. But most of these people are not considered to be disabled because their medical conditions do not impair their normal everyday activities. And we've just had a census, but I'm not even sure that that data with regards to chronic medical conditions and invisible disabilities is going to be very helpful, because I think the implications of COVID-19 on these two pieces, chronic medical conditions and invisible disabilities, is going to unfold in a way that has huge implications for thinking about inclusion and accessibility. And so this is a very, very relevant topic right now. So we've probably all heard stories about people getting out of their cars in the car park with their disabled badge, and they parked in the disabled spot, and they go into the store and they come back to find a note on their windscreen that says, "You're obviously not disabled. How dare you be in this spot? I saw you walking." That is the perfect definition of an invisible disability. But not everyone with an invisible disability gets to use or, you know, is approved to receive a disabled sticker. There are systemic, official barriers to accessibility for people with invisible disabilities, as well as those cultural pieces. and we've all probably had a moment where we see someone get out the car in the disabled parking spot and we are alarmed that they don't look disabled. That's what an invisible disability is. So we've got 26 million Americans, almost 1 in 10, that have a severe disability. This is data from the 1994 to 1995 survey of income and program participation. Only 1.8 million of those use a wheelchair. 5.2 million used a cane, crutches, or a walker. So we know that a disability cannot be determined solely by whether or not a person uses assistive equipment. And yet, that's where we tend to get stuck in our conversations, in our accommodations, in our design, and so on. And I know I have family members who refuse to use the accommodations available to them, even though they should, but because it creates all sorts of barriers, frankly, it's annoying and those sorts of things. And I just wonder if the world was designed differently, whether they'd be more willing to embrace the accommodations that would help them. So invisible disabilities, when you're designing for invisible disabilities, we really want you to think about all of these aspects. We want you to think about fatigue, chronic fatigue that's related to all these conditions, pain, primary sensory loss is included as an invisible disability. So that means hearing or visual loss or impairment, because sometimes, you don't have the big thick glasses or the big visible hearing aid. And then again, people make these sort of assumptions. Mental illnesses are included, asthma, respiratory conditions, neurodevelopmental differences is where we're going to spend time today, but also neurodegenerative conditions, if you think about the fact that we're talking about whole families through the lifespan. Musculoskeletal conditions, so that would include perhaps Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder that results in hypermobile joints and things like that, but more so probably arthritis would be in that category. But both of those might mean that you have differing ability on different days, according to the weather, according to how much rest you've had, according to how long the car journey was to get to the playground, and so on. And you've probably all heard stories of families traveling hours to get to the good playgrounds. And that can impact people with invisible disabilities. So all sorts of things but really we're thinking about, well, we'll talk about, I think this is on a future slide actually, but fatigue and pain and motor control and those things. So in neurodevelopmental differences, we will be talking about autism, and we'll be talking about mostly about differences in sensory processing, because that affects a large number of populations. So I'm speaking to you from this perspective of the social model of disability. And so we're just going to talk about that briefly. The medical model of disability is the pervasive model that is prevalent in countries around the world, which says that people are disabled by their impairments or differences. So under the medical model, these impairments or differences need to be fixed. They need to be changed by medical or other treatments, even when the impairment or difference doesn't cause pain or illness at times. The medical model looks at what's wrong with the person. It tends to create a narrative around it. We call it fait accompli. It's just, this is just the way it is. You just need to accept it. You're going to lose independence. There's going to be challenges with choice and control in your life. Fatalistic is the word I was looking for. The critics of the medical model see the impairment as the most important part of the conversation rather than the person. Like there's a sense of helplessness around what the person's able to do. The person's not really at the center of this model. It suggests that this person can't be equal because of the impairment they experience, and so that might reduce options. That would be a natural conclusion of this. And also the other thing that happens with the medical model is there's assumptions made about people's cognitive ability when they look physically disabled. So a perfect example of that is an individual in a wheelchair with a family member. The assumption is often that the family member is the caregiver. And public servants and attendants in train stations and all sorts of things tend to speak to the caregiver rather than the individual in the wheelchair. So the wheelchair user is maybe purchasing tickets to get on the train, and but the person at the ticket booth speaks to the caregiver, speaks over their head. That's a cultural example of how the medical model manifests. So there are all these assumptions, and so instead of presuming competence, quite the opposite is happening, and negative assumptions are being made. So it's essentially disableist because it defines everything in terms of an able-bodied norm instead of taking a viewpoint from the disabled person. And I'm hoping this video is going to work. It is not.
I always felt being a disabled person was a problem. After learning.
Okay, I'm going to show this video. So I'm going to stop share and then reshare. Apologize.
Being a disabled person was a problem. After learning about social model, it challenged me to look at disability completely differently. I myself was able to gain some confidence and self-esteem.
Social model basically says we are people with impairments, and those impairments clearly have an impact on how we live our lives. But the impairments are not the things which disable us.
I'm disabled by the world around me, and if the world was more accessible, I would be less disabled, and then I would just be left with my impairment, i.e. what doesn't work. It's not that my legs don't work that's disabling me, it's the fact that if I want to, if I'm on a flat surface, I can wheel around fine, I'm wonderfully happy. It's only when I come up to a flight of stairs.
As a wheelchair user, you have a slightly easier job of explaining the social model. Whereas if you're trying to explain the less physical barriers, it's much harder.
There's barriers everywhere in life to do with how we communicate, to do with people's attitudes.
Discovering the social model actually was a massive liberation on another level. Yeah, I was being treated differently, and no, it wasn't me being deficient, it was everybody else's social anxieties that were being projected onto me.
The blame for you not fitting in is no longer on your shoulders.
Suddenly, my disability is out there and not in here. It was what made me realise that I was something beyond the thing that other people thought I was.
It's a real liberating thing, but it also means you can change it. We can say to the world, look, you must put a lift in this building. You must make sure that the signage is readable for people with visual impairments.
If you want that equality to be real, you've really got to then tackle the inequality people are experiencing in schools, in workplaces, with transport.
The main reason that the social model I think is important to disabled people is that it allows us to be a community. You achieve a whole lot more as a group.
As long as we as disabled people make sure that our voices are heard and that all those people that support us also have their voices heard, I think we will get there.
I hope that Scope is doing work that will help disabled people to become prouder of who we are.
Pushing boundaries around who can be included and where.
Find out more about Scope's work and how to get involved by clicking below to subscribe to our YouTube channel.
So I just think some really interesting points were made there that I want to just highlight. one of the things that was said was the blame for you not fitting in is laid on your shoulders unless you are moving towards this social model of disability. But on the positives, the social model allows us to be a community. And isn't that really one of the things that drives the design of these spaces like playgrounds and parks? So the social model is really the perspective that I'm looking from. It proposes that what predominantly makes someone disabled is the attitudes and structures of society. It's a civil rights approach to disability. And it was created by disabled people primarily as a result of society's response to them, but also their experience of the health and welfare system, which made them feel socially isolated and oppressed. And we've talked about disability oppression already. So how can diverse populations thrive in a world designed by non-disabled people? It tends to be designed by a world of people within the bell curve of normal. And our community spaces are an ideal opportunity to change this. We're gonna include disabled voices and disabled perspectives in the design of our spaces. And we are gonna make universal design decisions that mean everyone can play. And again, I'm talking about the whole family system. So let's talk specifically about some of these invisible disabilities that we specialize in at STAR and what that means for inclusive design. So at STAR, our name, as you heard at the beginning, is STAR Institute for Sensory Processing. Sensory processing, or sensory integration and processing, as we call it in the occupational therapy field, is really describing the mechanisms of how we feel feelings. Feelings are like touch, movement, how we sense vision, how we hear sounds, and all of those pieces, and how we decide, our brains establish what that means. So it's how we feel feelings and what we do with that information, what action it produces. That's what sensory processing is. It's the process of making meaning of the world around us and the sensory data we get from our bodies. And so we're selecting and organizing sensations all the time, every day. You did it this morning when you woke up. You maybe, if you were lucky, you had a smell of a freshly roasted coffee, freshly made cup of coffee, or breakfast being cooked. And if you were unlucky, there was some more unpleasant smells in your house. You felt the sunlight on your face. You felt the blanket on your body telling you where your body was, and maybe your arm had gone to sleep because you were lying on it. That is a perfect example of how sensory processing can be alarming when it goes wrong. You put your feet on the carpet and you shifted your body up so that you could stand up. That was a sensory motor response. So everybody processes sensation all the time, every day. And so it is something that every nervous system is very busy doing. And it involves taking information from multiple sensory systems that impact and influence each other and sometimes often overlap, and to create the big picture. So your visual system, your auditory system, your tactile system are all working together with smell, with taste, your proprioceptive system, which we'll hear a bit more about in a second, and your vestibular system, which are more about how your body is moving or upright in space and the positions that it's in. They're all working together to create this big picture. Everybody does this. And in the same way as everybody breathes, and in the same way that everybody has a cardiovascular system, your sensory system can support your health and wellness, or if you have disordered sensory processing, it can derail your health and wellness. Every human being is so complex, so there is great potential here for what it means if sensory processing is disordered. It has huge implications. and it impacts every human. And so when we're talking about disordered sensory processing, there's this continuum. You know, we have exquisite sensory processing and integration that we see in our Olympic sportsmen, in our ice skaters and figure skaters, our gymnasts and our dancers, our aerialists, those people that are amazing at ski jumps and all of those things. So you can have highly developed sensory integration and processing that supports, you know, all of those wonderful achievements. But we all have differences in sensory processing. And then for some of us, our challenges in sensory processing are so profound that all day, every day, we feel bombarded and confused by the world around us. And that's when we talk about disordered sensory processing or sensory processing disorder. The mechanisms at the nervous system level, at the brain and body processing level of integrating and processing sensation are more problematic than helpful. And it interferes with my ability to participate in daily life. So we've got this continuum. And I'm arguing that the differences part in the middle here, which is all of us, we all have differences, we all have preferences, we all like a different amount of pressure in the massage that we get and different types of touch, and we prefer to be hugged a certain way, and we all have different taste in food. So we all have differences. And as you move towards sort of this more disordered presentation of these differences, my argument is that many of the people that present down here with differences in sensory processing don't need to be disabled by them, because if the world was designed differently and accommodations were made, these differences wouldn't need to interfere with participation and function. There is also, as I mentioned already, a population who have such profound challenges with sensory processing and integration that it is disabling for them, and it creates a great deal of challenge. And so, you know, but I'm just suggesting maybe all the people that we put in that bucket don't need to be there if the world was designed in a way that was more inclusive. So we're just going to hear, and we might have the same challenge with this slide, where I have to stop sharing, but I think it's worth it because you get to hear someone else speaking. So let's quickly move over to this young man who explains sensory integration and processing so nicely to us. And it's always nice to hear a different voice. Okay, it's just coming. Here we go. And he's so articulate. So let's let him be our teacher.
Hi, my name is Neil. I like classical music. I like to read comics. I also like to go to school. Something that I know a lot about and want to tell you about is sensory processing disorder. SPD is when the messages that your brain gets from your senses are not organized, so you don't respond to things like most people do. This makes it hard to do everyday life stuff like getting ready for the day, going to school, eating and playing. You can have SPD by itself, or you can have it with other things like autism. I have autism and SPD. Everyone has 7 sensory systems. They are sound, taste, smell, vision, touch, proprioceptive, and vestibular. Under-responsive versus over-responsive. You can think of your sensory systems as being a cup, and water is that type of a sensory input. If you are under-responsive to a certain sensory input, it is like you're a big, huge cup. You keep getting water to the big cup. You can just keep adding, but it never feels full. But If you are over-responsive, it is like you are a tiny cup. All you need is just a little sensory input and you overflow. You want your cup to be full and not spill over. Each of your sensory systems is their own cup and they are different sizes. Just because you have one big cup does not mean you are under-responsive with all your senses. I have a big cup for my proprioceptive and vestibular senses and a little cup for my touch, sound, taste, and smell senses. Everyone is different and unique. Some days and times of days are good, and some are too much for me. I don't like loud and busy places. I cover my ears and I want to run away or yell and tell everyone to be quiet. I need less noise to feel in control of my body. I like to always be moving. I have a hard time holding still. I don't like people to touch my skin sometimes. But everyone is different. My brother doesn't mind if people touch him, and he does not need to wear sunglasses. It is important to know your own body and to understand your body and your 7 senses. Sound. We get the sense of sound through our ears. When the sound is loud, I can't concentrate of anything except stopping the loud noises. I have a really hard time when my mom's turn on the vacuum or blender. Classical music makes me feel relaxed. I like jazz too. It's nearly the same thing. Taste and smell. When we eat or put things in our mouth, we use our chemical senses, taste and smell. Every time you eat, you use these senses. Vision. Our eyes are how we use our sense of vision. Some people like bright lights and lots of things to look at. I get distracted if there's too much to look at. I like things soft colors and organized. When I walk outside, the sun is always so bright that it hurts my eyes and I can't look up. I wear my sunglasses when I'm outside to help. Touch. Some people don't like to be touched, and I don't like my hands to be messy. It makes me feel bad. Touch is your tactile sense, and if you are not used to having things touching your skin, it can make you feel uncomfortable sometimes. Certain clothes, tags, and shoes can really feel not right for an opinion. For most people, their brain gets used to that uncomfortable clothes, but for me, I just can't think of anything else but the tag that is bothering me. I will tug on it and want to take it off the whole time I'm wearing it. We are trying to teach my hands that it is okay for them to be messy for a little while. The more I can play with things that are a little messy, the more I get used to it, and my brain learns not to focus on it as much. Proprioceptive. You can think of proprioception as your body awareness. You get proprioceptive input every time you get input through your muscles and joints. It sends a message to your brain that says, this is where I am and this is what I'm doing. You get proprioceptive input to help you do everything your body wants to do. Like pushing yourself on a scooter board, carrying something heavy, or even getting dressed. By doing more with your body, you can get more proprioceptive input. This helps me feel better. When I feel like my body is out of control, I like to jump, scooter board, or getting wrapped up tight in a blanket. Proprioceptive input helps me to calm down and organize my body. Vestibular. Your vestibular sense is super complicated but super cool. We all have something in our inner ear that tells the brain whether we are balanced and whether we are moving. It tells our brain whether I am right side up, upside down, moving forward or moving backward. It is what tells us that we are dizzy and better stop spinning. If our brain is under responsive to vestibular input, then our body wants to constantly move and spin, and we never get dizzy. If your brain is too responsive to vestibular input, then you feel off balance. It makes it scary to do activities where you have to tilt your head back or your feet are not flat on the ground. Our vestibular sense is very important to help us do everything we need to throughout the day. To figure out what your needs are, it helps to go and work with an occupational therapist. I have 2 of.
Okay, so this isn't a talk about occupational therapy, so I'm going to just stop the video there, but that's a great video that you can find online to teach to teach others and to share with others and to learn more. And I'm sure we'd be very happy to share resources if that would be helpful to people. So differences in sensory integration and processing are experienced by many, many populations. So a lot of our community members who are on the autism spectrum, and some people even think it's as high as like 96%, 100% of individuals on the autism spectrum have differences in sensory integration and processing. But it's also experienced a great deal by these other populations that I've listed here. And then there's a group where it's not a recognized standalone diagnosis, but that sensory processing disorder, and there's some evidence to show that this exists as a standalone disorder, even though it's not recognized by the diagnostic manual. Sensory integration and processing differences impact, like he was talking about, impact you when you are over responsive to sensation and when you are under responsive to sensation. We tend to think of it mostly as sensory overwhelm, but there's much more to the picture than that. It also, sometimes you can sense, you can register sensation, but you can't determine or discriminate what that sensation means. So you can have discrimination challenges that are different to being over responsive or under responsive. So I know I'm being touched, but I don't know where or how hard. I know I've stood on something, but I don't know the shape of it and if it was dangerous or not, because my nervous system can't discriminate. And that can be very stressful. And it can really impact the motor development. And that's where we talk about sensory motor. So how I coordinate the two sides of my body, how I hold myself upright in space, how I coordinate my eyes in my head, the way I'm able to use my hands and feet together, whether I can run, how tired I get, and all of those different things, climbing, all of those things can be highly impacted by differences in sensory integration and processing. And all of these are just some of the populations who have a high prevalence of differences. So it really is worth thinking about this population, learning more about it, and not just for playground design, but because sensory health supports health and well-being. So it might be helpful for you or a family member or so on. It's something that's important for us to understand. I'm sure you're aware of autism already. Don't rely on what you see on TV shows and movies and other things like that. There is this great movement out there of self-advocates who are really educating us on what it's like to have the lived experience of and what autistic culture is like. We're learning that there are ways of communicating within autistic culture. So autistic to autistic people can communicate better than autistic to non-autistic. And so we're learning all sorts of really interesting things about this population that has traditionally been pathologized quite a lot, and that medical model has been applied. They do benefit, people on the autism spectrum do benefit from thoughtful design of spaces. It's same in the workplace, same in the playgrounds, same in the classroom. This is how autism is classified by diagnostic manuals. And what we're learning is that it's much more complicated, and also that taking a strength-based approach to autism is well worth it. It has there are some amazing things that autism contributes when you're having a diverse and inclusive discussion or community-based experience. But we're thinking about that in playground design as well. So how are we going to make playgrounds that support our friends and our colleagues and our family members on the autism spectrum, and also these other areas? How are we going to support those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, individuals, and I mentioned fatigue a couple of times. Acquired brain injury is another invisible disability that has implications for sensory processing, but also, can be seen as more of a physical disability, and so on. So we've thought about accessible play. We've talked about, ADA as the minimum level requirements. And so, we want accessible play for the whole family. These are some of the pieces that we want in an accessible playground. We want graded play opportunities. We want social play opportunities. I've talked about that already. We want to keep things fun. I think that's easier to remember on the playground than in some other environments. Can everybody use their whole body in play in this environment, or are we restricting people to certain spaces? And is it integrated and included, which I've mentioned already? And so here are some of the more traditional accessible playground design pieces, thinking about companion seating, which is one of the more modern ways of including people on the playground, rather than having lines of benches with a playground option at one end, or the wheelchair user not being able to face the same way as everyone else in the bleachers and things like that. But there are ways of doing that better. And Chris Noel really has some great material about that. I think you can find a couple of his talks on YouTube. Water fountains, those sorts of things, designing them at different heights so that they're accessible for people using ambulatory aids, accessibility aids, and those sorts of things. Having signage, indicators on the floor and signage at different heights helps everybody. And there's also other things you can do with signage that we're going to talk about in just a second. So we want the whole family to be included. We want this cultural participation. And one of the ways to do that is if you are installing or updating playgrounds, is to involve the whole community in the design, including, of course, those members that are not normally able to access the playground. So those with disabilities or hidden disabilities, that's really helpful. So how can we support universal access through our playground spaces? You hopefully know about accessible surfacing. Just to say that accessible surfacing benefits everyone. It's a really good universal design principle. Those rubber safety surfaces are great, not just for wheelchair users, but if you have any kind of motor coordination challenge that impacts your running or walking or motor coordination, accessible surfacing is going to really support you. Changes in surface type, color, height, and grade add challenges for those people who have the less obvious challenges with movement, as well as for wheelchair users. And so that's something really simple that we can all do. What can we do to support these differences that I've already highlighted when we're designing playgrounds? Well, tactile and auditory options are a really classic piece that's included in design for playgrounds for children on the autism spectrum, for example, and they're great. They benefit every child, but they're not the whole picture. Yes, being able to play with something beautifully tactile is going to be delightful, and it's going to be welcoming, and it's going to be enjoyable for many, many children. But there's much more to it than that. You can have, of course, sensory gardens where there are flowers with scents and smells and colors. Please have them at different heights so that children who have challenges with moving their body up and down in space are able to access at least some of them. Don't have everything at ground level, have elevated tables. Sound gardens are great fun. Tactile stations, as I said, are wonderful. Again, be thinking about different access points and ways of accessing things. So, if it's accessible for a wheelchair, it's probably accessible for everyone. It's true, but think about rails, think about people who walk unsteadily, and so on. Elevated tables, I already said. But also thinking about opportunities for social interactions in these spaces for differently abled bodies, everybody. And so talk tubes are great. But what else can you add that's going to work for 2 or more people? Elevated platforms. I love these big swings that multiple people can get on. Roundabouts, we call them in England, and I always forget what they're referred to as in America. But you know, can everyone get on it and sit and spin and feel safe and do different things? Pushing those is just as good for a body as sitting on it, and in fact even better. So can everyone get access to pushing, to those pieces and those social interactions? We want these graded accesses, which I've talked about already, but you know, can you have 3 different ways to get onto the big feature, play equipment feature? So maybe you have a rocket themed park with a big play structure in the middle. Can you have 6 different approaches or 8 to getting onto it with different types of supports and handholds and levels of difficulty? And can you do all of those things without making the easy access options look like they're only designed for babies or toddlers? That's really, that's not universal design, and it's not welcoming. So thinking about all of these different things, like, can everybody get onto the raised platforms? It's really good for kids to get on raised platforms, regardless of their ability to walk or climb or push themselves in a wheelchair or be pushed in a wheelchair. Can you have lots of different swing options for children with different abilities to hold themselves upright? Now, normally, you know, there's an ADA swing, but could we move away from just having the strap swings and the bucket swings as the other options? What other swing opportunities can we provide? Cozy, quiet spaces and playhouses are something we really encourage people to think about installing, because they help when I'm overwhelmed. I can go and get organized there, but they also help with pretend play and social play. So thinking about how everyone can access those spaces and not putting a huge table in the space, that means that not, you know, it restricts what type of body can get in there and things like that. Different height windows, all of those pieces are really important to think about. So thinking about multi-purpose tables and chairs, open spaces with ground level play components, providing shade and places to rest is something that we see that is often missing. And then there's also communication supports. So for example, a lot of playgrounds now are installing these communication boards that support a child's ability to, when words are more difficult for that child, or if they're a non-speaking child. And then you can have a board that's related to your playground, or even related to the theme of your playground. So all of that's really, really beneficial. Play is highly beneficial for brains and bodies and social connections and all of those different things. And playgrounds are an extension of the community. So this is where all of this is coming from. But it might be helpful for you to look at the concept of well-being if you're needing to make an argument for an inclusive playground. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development measures well-being, and they measure what's called eudaimonic well-being or subjective well-being as a marker for how successful a community is and an economy is. And because when playground spaces, sorry, I've jumped a little bit there, but because, let's look at the measures, what they're looking at. They're looking at autonomy, competence, interest in learning, goal orientation, sense of purpose, resilience, social engagement, caring, and altruism. That they're measuring this as a marker of flourishing, and therefore how successful an economy and a community is doing. And so it's really useful to think about this as a measure of society's progress, because the connection I'm making, and I jumped to a little bit a second ago, is that playgrounds, play, community spaces, social participation, meaningful activities support flourishing in individuals and families and communities. So I really do believe that playgrounds are important. STAR's been researching with landscape structures for years, and I just wanted to talk quickly about 2 projects that you might find helpful to refer to. We have we've moved buildings recently, and so we left behind our beautiful playground, and we're looking forward to installing our new playground when COVID hopefully has settled down and the ground isn't frozen anymore. There's snow on the ground here right now. But one of the pieces that we installed in consultation and they designed in consultation with STAR is this sand and water play piece, where there's so much opportunity for social engagement. It's really quite wonderful. I was
thinking about an idea. Okay. Building a sand castle.
Can I help?
Yes, please.
Okay, what should I do?
Do this, please.
Build this with sand?
Yes, please. Thanks for helping.
Welcome.
We're having so much fun today.
We are having so much fun today. I'm so glad you're back from your vacation.
Yeah. You know what? I changed my mind.
What?
I like the playground.
Oh, I'm glad you changed your mind.
And so, you know, you could see but he was very much in control, but this is actually therapy taking place on the playground, and there's several things I want to point out about that. But he you know, that was a really interesting piece of play equipment for him, where he was able to go in slowly and more engage with what was happening. And he is a child who found that sand sensation unpleasant, but it really benefits to be in there playing with the sand. And what we saw was that he was more interactive in that space. He was less inhibited. He was less nervous. He was braver. And he was able to tolerate more types of play, and he was more collaborative in that space. And so, you know, when a child says, I think I've got an idea, which is what he said, we all celebrate. And playgrounds are great spaces for this. But it's not just children who demonstrate more freedom in their play on the playground. It's also parents. And so having these pieces of play that are designed to be multisensory and socially engaging is really going to be beneficial for all children and all families. In this slide, you can see what percentage of time was spent when children were playing in the sand and water feature. So these are areas that were being focused on for these children. What happened is that they started doing more and more of the play we were looking for on this. And one of the things that's really challenging for many children who have differences in sensory processing and integration is novelty and playing with new things. And playgrounds are such a great place to introduce something a bit novel. And that's why often as OTs, we're asking families to travel not just to the same playground all the time, but to different playgrounds. So there's a lot happening there in that. If we saw something happening at the same time, we did code both in this. And so in this one, what we were seeing is that children who just had a hard time playing full stop on the playground with supports were showing an increase in all of these different aspects of play that will help them in the classroom. This will help them with their academic skills. And then there's another study that used the playground as a tool to measure the improvements in sensory motor play, levels of play, and parent-child interactions before and after treatment. And this is really exciting because the parent-child interactions improved. Parents joined in with the child. The child was better able to engage in sensory play. There's this big leap, this big improvement. Playgrounds have tremendous therapeutic and healing potential for individuals and for whole communities. They can be places of health and healing. And that's why we get so excited about them. And so I hope that the different pieces we've talked about today are helpful for you, inspiring for you. I'd be very happy to share resources if you're interested in any of those. And yeah, I keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Yes, I would love any resources I'd love to share afterwards. We usually do a recap for people who RSVP'd for the event and just kind of share links or any kind of things that you think would be like really useful resources for folks who are interested in exploring this further.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can do that.
One thing I was sort of curious about that I'm sure comes up a lot is when people talk about budget and what they have, funding for, and then also maintenance of certain things. And so I was curious if you've found, just sort of in the work you've done, have people come up with creative solutions to deal with maintenance concerns? One thing that kind of came to mind as I was watching, in Texas, I think we have particularly a very hard time with the rubber surfacing because it cracks. We have such, our weather is so specifically hard on that kind of surfacing. And so then it becomes like an expensive maintenance issue. And I think, that's been part of the move to like the kind of mulch, your wood fiber. Partly it's, comes down to cost.
Yeah.
I was curious, but I could see how it would become, a difficult thing to navigate for kids with mobility issues or a whole host of other things. Just looking at this, so I'm just sort of, I know there's probably not just one answer, but I'm curious, like, has that come up before in conversations with people, or?
I lived in Hong Kong before I moved here, and so there's a specific type of poured rubber that we use a lot in Hong Kong, and there's a lot of heat and humidity in Hong Kong, and I can try and find out more about that. But I know asphalt, also is in many ways better. It's just not soft. It's not going to give you any kind of that sense of soft landing. So I think what I'm going to suggest I do is reach out to a couple of people with that specific question. A couple of the people that we've worked with at STAR, and say, what do you recommend in high temperatures that is an accessible surface? And then you can share that in the resources when I get that back to you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We have one question from Facebook. She says, our school district has an emphasis on social emotional learning. So in AISD, that's a big focus in the last few years is promoting curriculum around social emotional learning. How could we build on that in park design for inclusion?
I think for me, it would be about supporting relational play in those playground spaces. And supporting the whole family to play and kids to play together. And so, there is another video that I didn't show you guys because of time, which we can share in the resources, but it shows some inclusive playground designs that Landscape Structures have done. And it shows how these sort of, they're different types of play equipment than your traditional play equipment, but they invite ideas. And so one of the things that we know supports emotional learning is pretend play and having new ideas about play, of how to do things like, and the classic example of this is, in childhood, a chair is a rocket, a spaceship, or a box. A cardboard box is the perfect example, isn't it? Because you can't give a child a better present than a cardboard box at Christmas. It doesn't matter how expensive the toy inside was. It's a rocket, it's a house, it's a TV, it's a washing machine. Those are boring examples because I'm a grown-up. And then to a grown-up, it's a cardboard box for storage, or it's for taking to the recycling center. And so we stop being so creative with our ideas in adulthood. But what we want to encourage in our children is open-ended play opportunities in the design of the playgrounds. So there isn't a piece of equipment with only one way to play on it, because having all those ideas supports collaboration and it supports emotional development. Pretend play, pretending anything really helps with the type of thinking that the brain has to do for emotional processing and developing emotional intelligence.
That's excellent. Yeah. One thing in Austin, there's been a big emphasis on the development of nature play spaces. And so that's in the long range plan process, a lot of people express interest in there being more nature play opportunities. And the Cities Connecting Children to Nature program is really invested in trying to create more infrastructure around nature play. And the idea is similar to what you're saying. It's to help promote imaginative play, open-ended play, so that there isn't just sort of one way that you can use this play feature. And so, you know, a lot of traditional play equipment does have this sort of limited play value, whereas nature play is more open-ended. Have you
Right.
found any examples of nature play or something similar?
I mean, for me, my favorite playground designs bring nature into the design of the playground.
Mhm.
You know, I love, and my kids love the playgrounds with a theme. But for me, as an occupational therapist, I see such tremendous value, developmental and therapeutic value in playgrounds that are an extension of the natural world. I also think that those colors tend to be easier on nervous systems that are sensitive to sensory data. But you know, what you have when you have these playgrounds inspired by nature is exactly that. You have a lot of open-ended ideas, and a tree house can be a tree house or a pirate ship or a you know, something from Frozen or the Mandalorian. But you know, when you've already assigned a pretend play theme to a tree house, it's going to be more limiting. So that's sort of been my experience. I love there's a I love playgrounds that back onto, you know, safe natural places to play as well, and incorporating both. I think getting outside and playing in nature is we're realizing we've lost something magical, and we're returning to it because it's got so much value for health and wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I'm glad to hear you say that, you know, also resonates with the work that you do. Another question that came in was, are there resources in Spanish or other languages on this topic that you know of?
On sensory processing, there are, yes. I can share some with you. Okay. One of the things we did at STAR this last month was Sensory Awareness Month, and we released 5 sensory stories. They are available in Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Italian, German, and hopefully soon a couple of other languages. And what they do, they're really, really easy to understand stories about how sensory processing impacts development, health, wellness through the lifespan. So from a sensory processing perspective, there's some other handouts I can send you. Inclusive playground design, I don't know of anything in Spanish, but if I find it, I will send it your way.
Yeah, I'll do some research myself. Nothing that I've seen before, but that's obviously, I think, you know, most, you know, we as an organization are trying to have more materials in other languages. I think it seems like a goal of a lot of organizations to be inclusive in that respect as well.
Yeah, it's really important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Virginia. I really appreciate you speaking to everyone. This will be on Facebook. It'll continue on Facebook in the event, and also we'll post it on austinparks.org/parks-summit. So if you want to refer back to it, there was a lot of content in the presentation, so it's really exciting. There's lots to dip back into. So I definitely will be revisiting it and to share with folks. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.